The house smelled like mildew and old wood, its silence broken only by the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Emma sat on the living room floor, surrounded by cardboard boxes filled with her father's belongings. The weight of his absence pressed against her chest. 2 months had passed since his death, but the questions lingered like a storm cloud over her family. Her father, Michael, had died alone in his study, a heart attack, the doctors said. But Emma knew better. His death came just weeks after a bitter argument with her older brother, Ian. They hadn't spoken since. The tension between them was suffocating. It was the reason she was here now, sifting through her father's things, searching for something. A letter, a diary, anything that might explain the secrets he'd taken to the grave. In the bottom of one box, hidden beneath old tax documents and faded photographs, Emma found it. A small black device with worn dials and a cracked speaker. Beside it lay a folded piece of paper in her father's handwriting. "Use only if you're ready for the truth." Emma's breath caught. She recognized it from the paranormal shows her dad used to watch late at night. A spirit box. He always said it was a tool to connect with the other side, to hear the voices of the dead. She'd laughed it off back then, but now, holding it in her hands, a chill ran down her spine. That night, Emma sat cross-legged in the study, the spirit box placed on the desk where her father had died. The room felt heavier than the rest of the house, as though the walls themselves remembered his pain. Outside, rain tapped against the window, and the wind howled through the trees. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the power switch. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. But the questions gnawed at her. Why had her father been so secretive in his final days? Why had he and Ian fought so bitterly? She flicked the switch. The box whirred to life, filling the room with static. The sound was harsher than she expected, grating and chaotic. She adjusted the dial, her pulse quickening as fragments of voices began to emerge. Faint, disjointed, like whispers lost in a storm. "Dad," she said, "are you here?" The static deepened, a low hum vibrating through the room. Then a voice cut through the noise, faint but unmistakable. "Emma." Her stomach clenched. "Dad, is it really you?" "Yes." The word was clear, almost too clear, as if someone had spoken directly into her ear. She shivered, the hairs on her arms standing on end. "Why did you and Ian fight?" she asked. "What were you hiding?" There was a pause, the static crackling like dry leaves. Then, "Ask him." Frustration bubbled up inside her. "I did. He won't tell me anything. Please, Dad, I need to know." The box sputtered, the voice growing fainter. "The safe. Basement." Emma's heart sank. The basement. She hated that place. It was cold, damp, and filled with shadows that seemed to move when you weren't looking. But if that's where the answers were, she had no choice. The basement smelled of earth and decay. Emma's flashlight flickered as she descended the creaking wooden stairs. The spirit box sat in her pocket, still emitting a faint, static hum. At the far end of the room, hidden behind stacks of old furniture, she found it. A small, rusted safe bolted to the wall. The combination lock was stiff, but after several tries, it clicked open. Inside was a single envelope. Her name was scrawled on the front in her father's handwriting. Hands shaking, she tore it open. The letter inside was short but devastating. "Emma, if you're reading this, I'm already gone. Ian isn't your brother. He's your half-brother. Your mother had an affair before you were born. I forgave her, but Ian never did. When he found out, he blamed me for keeping it a secret. That's why we fought. He couldn't forgive me. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. Please understand, I was trying to protect you. Love, Dad." The room spun. Ian wasn't her brother. Her mother had an affair. She clutched the letter. Suddenly, the spirit box in her pocket crackled to life. "Emma." She froze. The voice was different this time, harsher, angrier. "Leave," it hissed. Emma backed away from the safe. "Who are you?" she whispered. The voice grew louder, a growl that seemed to echo off the walls. "You shouldn't have come." Her flashlight flickered and died, plunging the basement into darkness. The static from the spirit box grew deafening, the voices overlapping. Emma stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Then a new voice cut through the noise, calm, familiar.
Emma, run!
It was her father. She didn't need to be told twice. Clutching the letter, she bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind her. She collapsed in the hallway. The spirit box in her pocket went silent. The next morning, Emma confronted Ian. His reaction to the letter was immediate. His face turned pale, his jaw tightening with anger. "So, you know," he said, his voice cold. "You should have told me," Emma said. "Why didn't you?" Ian's hands clenched into fists. "Because he wasn't the saint you think he was. He lied to both of us our entire lives. He let me grow up believing we were a family when all along I was just some mistake he tried to sweep under the rug." Emma's heart ached. "That's not true. He loved you. He loved both of us." Ian shook his head, his eyes dark with resentment. "You don't get it, Emma. You never will." He turned and walked away, leaving her alone with the weight of the truth. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She sat in the living room, the spirit box on the table in front of her. She had so many questions, but she was afraid of the answers. Still, she couldn't resist. She flicked the switch. The static returned, louder this time, almost angry. She leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dad? Are you there?" The static crackled, then went silent. For a moment, she thought it hadn't worked. Then a voice emerged. But it wasn't her father's, not him. The room grew cold, the shadows seeming to stretch and twist. Emma's breath caught in her throat. "Who are you?" she asked. The voice laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent a chill down her spine.
"You let me in."
The spirit box erupted in a burst of static, the dials spinning wildly. Emma lunged forward to turn it off, but before she could, the voice spoke again, louder this time.
"Now we're family."
The box went silent. Emma sat frozen as a faint laugh echoed through the house. Some secrets, she realized, should stay buried. Claire tightened her coat against the evening chill as she stepped into the old farmhouse. The door creaked on its hinges, echoing through the empty rooms. Dust hung in the air, disturbed only by her hesitant footsteps. She hadn't planned to come here. The farmhouse, her grandmother's home, had been abandoned for years. But last week, while sorting through a box of old belongings after the funeral, Claire had stumbled upon her grandmother's journal. It was filled with strange entries, rushed handwriting describing voices in the walls, warnings not to stay after dark, and a cryptic final note: "The walls know. Use the box if you must, but don't linger." Wrapped inside the journal was an old spirit box, the kind Claire had only seen in ghost hunting shows. She hadn't believed in that sort of thing before, but her grandmother had been a grounded, no-nonsense woman. Something about the journal's urgency gnawed at her. The farmhouse smelled of decay, mold, rotting wood, and something faintly metallic. Claire shivered as she walked into the kitchen, where a warped wooden table still stood beneath a grimy window. She set the journal and the spirit box down, her fingers trembling as she unwrapped the device. The box was surprisingly intact, its knobs still smooth under her touch. Claire powered it on. Static crackled through the silence, filling the room with a low hum. Her voice wavered as she spoke. "Grandma, are you here?" At first, the static remained constant, broken only by faint pops and hisses. Then, like a whisper carried on the wind, a voice emerged, soft and familiar.
"Claire."
Her breath caught. She leaned closer to the box. "Grandma, is it really you?"
"Yes."
The voice was faint, distorted, but unmistakable. "Why did you write about voices? What's in the walls?" The response came quickly, sharp and urgent.
"Don't trust them."
Claire's skin prickled. She glanced around the dim kitchen, her eyes lingering on the peeling wallpaper and cracked plaster. The house groaned, as if reacting to her grandmother's warning. She tried again. "Who are they? What do they want?" The static swelled, the voice growing fainter.
"They watch, they listen."
Claire's stomach churned. Her grandmother's journal had mentioned hearing whispers, but Claire had dismissed it as paranoia. Now she wasn't so sure. A sudden noise broke her thoughts, a faint scraping sound like nails on wood. It came from the wall to her left. She froze, her heart thudding as the sound grew louder, more deliberate. "Grandma," she whispered into the spirit box. "What do I do?" The reply was immediate.
Leave.
Claire's instinct screamed at her to run, but something kept her rooted in place. She had come for answers, and she wasn't leaving without them. Summoning her courage, she followed the sound to the far corner of the kitchen, where a section of the wall appeared slightly warped. The wallpaper there was torn, revealing old, splintered wood beneath. The spirit box crackled to life again without her prompting. Her grandmother's voice came through, strained and insistent.
They hide. There.
Claire's hand shook as she pried at the loose wood with a nearby kitchen knife. The panel gave way with a groan, revealing a hollow space within the wall. Inside was a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth. She unwrapped it carefully, her breath catching as she revealed its contents. An old photograph, a child's bracelet, and a weathered notebook. The photograph showed her grandmother as a young woman, standing beside a man Claire didn't recognize. The bracelet was engraved with a name, Margaret. Claire opened the notebook. The pages were filled with her grandmother's handwriting, detailing a life Claire had never known. The man in the photo, it seemed, had been her grandmother's first husband, a cruel and controlling figure who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. One entry stood out, written in shaky, hurried script. "The Watchers came after I buried him. They know. They're always listening. I hear them in the walls at night. I don't know what they want, but they won't let me leave." Claire's blood ran cold. She glanced around the kitchen, suddenly aware of how the walls seemed to close in on her. The scraping sound returned, louder now, coming from all around her. The spirit box sprang to life again, emitting a low, garbled hum. A voice emerged, but this time it wasn't her grandmother's. It was deeper, harsher, and carried an edge of malice.
Why are you here?
Claire's throat tightened. "Who are you?" she managed to whisper. The response came in fragmented bursts, each word more chilling than the last.
We are always here.
The scraping turned to pounding, as though something inside the walls was trying to break free. The air grew thick, making it hard to breathe. Claire grabbed the spirit box and shouted into it, her voice trembling with fear. "Grandma, what do they want?" The box crackled violently before her grandmother's voice broke through, urgent and desperate.
Go, now.
Claire stumbled back, clutching the spirit box and the notebook. As she moved toward the door, the pounding grew louder, more frantic. The walls seemed to bulge, as though something inside them was pressing outward. Before she could leave, the spirit box spoke again, but this time it wasn't her grandmother or the malevolent voice. It was a child's voice, soft and pleading.
Don't leave me.
Claire froze, her mind racing. The bracelet, the name Margaret. Was it possible the child was trapped here too? "Who are you?" she asked.
Margaret.
The voice whispered. The walls groaned and the child's voice grew fainter.
Help me, please.
Claire's instinct screamed at her to run, but she couldn't abandon the voice. She turned back to the hollow space in the wall, shining her phone's flashlight into the darkness. The beam revealed more objects hidden inside. A tiny shoe, a porcelain doll, and something glinting faintly in the light. It was a gold locket. Claire opened it, revealing a photograph of her grandmother and a little girl, Margaret. Tears welled in her eyes as the child's voice echoed faintly from the spirit box.
Don't let them keep me.
Claire left the house at dawn, clutching the locket, the bracelet, and the notebook. She didn't destroy the spirit box, nor did she fully understand what had happened. But she knew one thing: the house wasn't empty, and the Watchers weren't done. Days later, as she researched her family history, she discovered that Margaret had been her grandmother's first child, a sister Claire had never known. The records ended abruptly, with no mention of what had happened to her. The farmhouse was demolished a month later, the property sold to developers. But even as the land was cleared, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that the Watchers hadn't left. Sometimes, late at night, she swore she could hear faint whispers coming from her own walls. Some secrets aren't meant to be unearthed. and some voices refused to be silenced. The rain hammered against the windshield as Emma turned off the highway, following the narrow road to her childhood home. The old house loomed at the end of the gravel driveway, its outline barely visible through the downpour. It had been a decade since she'd set foot here, and if it weren't for her mother's funeral, she wouldn't have come back at all. Her mother, Ruth, had always been a superstitious woman. Growing up, Emma had dismissed her constant warnings about spirits and signs as eccentric quirks. But during her final days, Ruth's beliefs had turned desperate. She'd left a voicemail on Emma's phone 2 days before her death, her voice thin and pleading. "Please, Emma, go to the attic. You need to know the truth. I can't rest until you do." Emma had ignored the message at the time, brushing it off as another one of her mother's episodes. But now, standing in the rain-soaked driveway with Ruth's words echoing in her mind, she felt a gnawing sense of guilt. The house was just as she remembered. Dim, cold, and heavy with the smell of mildew. Her footsteps echoed on the wooden floor as she made her way to the attic. The pull-down ladder creaked under her weight, and the air grew colder as she ascended. The attic was cluttered with decades of forgotten belongings. Boxes of yellowed newspapers, broken furniture, and old toys. In the far corner, a trunk sat partially open, its contents spilling onto the dusty floor. Among the papers and trinkets, Emma spotted a small, rectangular device, a spirit box. Her stomach tightened. Her mother had spoken about using a spirit box to communicate with her late husband, Emma's father, after he died. Emma had always thought it was a coping mechanism, a way for Ruth to deal with her grief. But why had her mother been so insistent about this now? Beside the box was a faded envelope with Emma's name scrawled across the front. She tore it open and unfolded the letter inside. "Emma, I know you don't believe in these things, but I beg you to listen. The box works. I've used it to speak to him, to your father, but there's something else, something darker. I think I've made a mistake. Please ask him what happened. He'll tell you. And Emma, whatever you do, don't turn it off until he's finished." Emma's hands trembled as she picked up the spirit box. The device was old but functional, its knobs smooth from years of use. She sat cross-legged on the attic floor, the rain tapping against the roof above her. She hesitated before turning it on. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, but her curiosity outweighed her skepticism. With a deep breath, she flicked the switch. Static filled the air, sharp and crackling. Emma adjusted the frequency, her heart racing despite herself. "Dad?" she said tentatively. "Are you there?" For a moment, nothing changed. Then, through the hiss of static, a voice emerged, faint but familiar.
Emma, is that you?
Her breath caught. It was his voice, exactly as she remembered. "Dad, is it really you?"
Yes,
the voice said more clearly now.
it's me.
Emma's throat tightened. She hadn't heard his voice in nearly 20 years. "Why did Mom leave this for me? What's going on?" The response was slow, as though he were choosing his words carefully.
She needed to protect you.
"Protect me from what?" The static surged, and for a moment she thought the connection had broken. Then his voice returned, strained and urgent.
From her.
Emma's skin prickled. "Her? Who are you talking about?" The static deepened, crackling like distant thunder.
Not your mother. The other one. She's in the house.
Emma's pulse quickened as she glanced around the attic. The shadows seemed darker now, the corners deeper. She gripped the box tightly. "What do you mean? What's in the house?"
She's been here. Long time.
The voice said, trailing off.
Your mother tried. Stop her.
Emma's mind raced. Was this some kind of elaborate prank her mother had set up? But the fear in her father's voice felt too real. "Why didn't Mom tell me?" she demanded.
She thought she could keep you safe,
The voice replied.
but she was wrong. You have
"To..." The voice cut off abruptly, replaced by a low guttural growl. Emma's blood ran cold. The growling gave way to a new voice, one that sent shivers down her spine. It was feminine, lilting and cruel.
She tried to hide, but I always find what I want.
Emma scrambled backward, her back hitting the wall. "Who are you?" she shouted into the box. The voice laughed, a sound that seemed to echo around the room.
You don't remember me? You used to talk to me when you were little, in the basement.
Emma's breath caught. Flashes of forgotten memories surfaced, sitting on the basement steps, whispering to the darkness, convinced she had an imaginary friend. She had named her Elsie. "You're not real," Emma said, her voice shaking.
Oh, I'm very real,
Elsie replied.
Your mother knew that. That's why she tried to lock me away.
Emma's eyes darted to the trunk. Beneath the spirit box, she saw an old jar sealed with wax. Strange symbols were etched into its surface. Emma grabbed the jar. "Is this what she used to trap you?" Elsie's voice turned sharp.
Don't touch that.
The attic seemed to groan around her, the air growing thick and oppressive. Emma felt a wave of nausea as a foul smell filled the room, like rot and decay.
Emma.
Her father's voice broke through the static, weak but determined.
Seal her. Again. Don't let her out.
Tears streamed down Emma's face as she held the jar tightly. How? What do I do? The static surged, and her father's voice faded, replaced by Elsie's furious scream.
You can't stop me. Not again.
Emma scanned the attic, her eyes landing on a box of old candles and matches. She grabbed one, lighting it with shaking hands. The symbols on the jar seemed to shimmer in the flickering light, recalling fragments of her mother's old stories. Emma placed the jar in the center of the attic and surrounded it with the candles. She whispered a prayer, a desperate plea for protection, as the flames danced. Elsie's voice grew louder, more frantic.
You can't do this. You need me, Emma. I've always been with you.
The candles flared, their light filling the room. The jar shook violently, and for a moment, Emma thought it would shatter. But then, with a final deafening scream, the attic fell silent. Emma sat in the quiet attic, the spirit box silent and the candles burnt out. The jar was still, its symbols dark and cold. She carried it downstairs and buried it deep in the backyard, just as her mother had written in the journal she found beside the trunk. Emma left the house the next morning, her heart heavy but resolute. She would never return, but she felt a strange sense of peace. Whatever her mother had fought to protect her from was gone. At least, she hoped it was. Years later, Emma would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, her ears straining for the faintest sound of static or a distant lilting voice. And though she told herself it was just her imagination, she never could quite shake the feeling that Elsie was still watching. Some childhood friends are better left forgotten, and some houses never truly let you leave.